He fired me during the board meeting, right in front of 14 people. But he didn't know. I'd brought a list with me. And that list nearly landed him in federal court. I should have stayed quiet, signed the termination papers, and disappeared. But while he was reading out my dismissal to the entire room, I just smiled and pulled out the one thing he feared most, the evidence that would destroy everything he'd built on lies and stolen money. My name is Emily Carson, and at 39, I thought I'd seen every kind of corporate snake oil salesman Denver had to offer. I was wrong. For 3 years, I'd served as assistant CFO at Lunaris Ventures, a mid-sized private equity firm nestled in the glass towers of the Denver Tech Center. We weren't Goldman Sachs, but we moved enough money to matter, $200 million in managed assets, with fingers in everything from biotech startups to renewable energy projects. I was the numbers person, the one who made sure every dollar had a paper trail and every investment decision could survive an audit. The CEO, Margaret Walsh, trusted me completely. She'd hired me away from a Big Four accounting firm specifically because I had a reputation for catching discrepancies that others missed. "You're my insurance policy," she'd tell me during our monthly reviews. "You see the cracks before they become sinkholes." But if Margaret was my champion, Dane Holloway was my nightmare. Dane ran project operations, which meant he oversaw the due diligence process for every deal we considered. On paper, he was competent, Harvard MBA, 15 years in private equity, the kind of resume that looked impressive in investor presentations. In reality, he was a master manipulator who'd perfected the art of looking indispensable while systematically undermining anyone who might expose his methods. He had this way of making you feel small in meetings, cutting you off mid-sentence with a condescending smile, then redirecting the conversation to make it seem like your concerns were petty or uninformed. "Emily's being overly cautious again," he'd say, chuckling as if my attention to detail was charming but irrelevant. The other executives would nod along, not because they agreed, but because disagreeing with Dane had a way of making your next project review go poorly. For months, I'd been noticing irregularities in the consulting fees he approved. Small amounts at first, $15,000 here, $30,000 there, always labeled as third-party due diligence or specialized market research. When I'd ask for the actual reports these fees supposedly paid for, Dane would wave me off. "Confidential preliminary assessments," he'd say. "You'll see the final versions when they're ready." But the final versions never came, and the amounts kept growing. By my calculations, over the past 6 months alone, Dane had approved nearly $400,000 in mysterious consulting fees. The vendors were always different, always obscure LLCs registered in Delaware or Nevada. And every single payment had been personally authorized by Dane, bypassing the normal approval chain that should have included my review. I'd tried raising concerns with Margaret, but Dane was clever. He'd schedule his explanations for times when I wasn't in the room, then reference those conversations as if they were common knowledge. As I explained to Margaret last week, he'd begin, making me look like I wasn't paying attention to decisions I'd never heard discussed. So I'd started documenting everything, every suspicious payment, every deflected question, every time he'd undermined my authority in front of the team. I told myself I was just being thorough, just doing my job. I had no idea I was building a case that would bring down a $2 million fraud scheme. The first time Dane openly challenged my authority, I should have seen it coming. It was during our quarterly investment review, and I'd prepared a detailed analysis of our portfolio performance. I'd spent weeks on the numbers, cross-referencing every metric, every assumption. "I think Emily's projections are a bit optimistic," Dane interrupted, not even looking up from his phone. "Her models don't account for the market volatility we're seeing." The room went quiet. Margaret raised an eyebrow. "What specifically concerns you, Dane?" He launched into a critique that was pure theater. Technical-sounding objections that crumbled under scrutiny, but delivered with enough confidence to plant seeds of doubt. By the end of his performance, my carefully researched presentation felt defensive rather than authoritative. After the meeting, Margaret pulled me aside. "Your work is solid," she said quietly, But you need to learn to push back more effectively. Dane's got a point about being prepared for pushback. Except Dane didn't have a point. He'd manufactured controversy where none existed, and somehow I was the one being coached on presentation skills. That's when I started paying closer attention to the money trails. The suspicious consulting fees weren't random. They followed a pattern. Every time we were evaluating a major acquisition, Dane would approve payments to shell companies I'd never heard of. The timing was always the same, right after our initial due diligence meetings. But before we'd make formal offers, I started running the vendor names through business registries. Most were Delaware LLCs with minimal public information, but a few had interesting connections. One company, Strategic Assessment Partners, listed an address that turned out to be a UPS store in Wilmington. Another, Meridian Research Group, had been incorporated just 3 days before receiving its first payment from us. But the real breakthrough came when I found the bank records. I'd been working late, reconciling our quarterly statements, when I noticed something odd. 3 of the consulting payments had been flagged by our bank's fraud detection system, not because they were suspicious, but because they'd been processed as international wire transfers. The flags had been cleared by someone with executive override privileges, someone like Dane. I pulled the wire transfer records. The money wasn't going to consulting firms. It was going to accounts in the Cayman Islands, the British Virgin Islands, and one particularly creative setup in Singapore. The account names were different, but the routing information told a story of layered shell companies and financial structures designed to obscure ownership. Over the next month, I worked backward through 18 months of transactions. The scope was staggering. Dane had been systematically diverting money from our due diligence budgets, our operational expenses, even our charitable giving accounts. He'd created fake vendors, forged approval documents, and manufactured entire paper trails to justify payments that disappeared into offshore accounts. The total was $2.3 million. But Dane wasn't just stealing money. He was positioning himself as indispensable while systematically destroying my credibility. Every time I'd raised concerns about budgets or processes, he'd used those conversations as evidence that I was difficult to work with or resistant to new approaches. He'd been playing a long game, and I was the designated fall guy. The breaking point came during our annual strategy meeting. Dane had prepared a presentation about optimizing our operational efficiency that included recommendations to streamline our financial oversight processes. Translation: reduce my authority and eliminate the controls that had helped me discover his scheme. As he spoke, I realized he wasn't just planning to continue stealing. He was planning to remove the one person who could expose him. That's when I decided to stop documenting and start preparing for war. The ambush came on a Tuesday morning in March. I should have known something was wrong when Dane arrived early. His usual smug confidence replaced by something sharper, more focused. He'd been avoiding me for weeks, ever since I'd started asking pointed questions about vendor payments during our leadership meetings. Emergency board meeting, Margaret announced at 9 a.m., conference room A, 15 minutes. I grabbed my laptop and files, assuming we were dealing with a client crisis or regulatory issue. Instead, I walked into a room where 14 people sat around our mahogany conference table, all looking uncomfortable. The entire executive team was there, plus our 3 external board members who'd flown in from New York and Chicago. Dane sat at the far end, a thick folder in front of him, wearing the expression of someone about to deliver bad news with great pleasure. "Thank you all for coming on short notice," Margaret began, but Dane cut her off. "Actually, Margaret, I think I should handle this." He stood, opening his folder with theatrical precision. "We have a serious internal matter that requires immediate attention." My stomach dropped, not because I was afraid of what he might say, but because I recognized the setup. This wasn't a discussion. This was an execution. Over the past several months, we've discovered significant irregularities in our financial reporting processes. Dane continued, his voice carrying the weight of manufactured authority. "Internal communications have been leaked to unauthorized parties. Confidential client information has been shared without proper clearance, and there's been a pattern of insubordination that's undermining our operational efficiency." He was looking directly at me now, and I felt every pair of eyes in the room follow his gaze. I'm afraid we have no choice but to terminate Emily Carson's employment with Lunaris Ventures, effective immediately. The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Margaret's face went white. Dane, what the hell? I have documentation, he said smoothly, pulling out printed emails. Here's Emily questioning our due diligence processes in ways that could be interpreted as industrial espionage. Here's her accessing files outside her normal scope of responsibility. And here's evidence that she's been compiling information about our internal operations for unknown purposes. Every piece of evidence was real, but twisted. The emails where I'd raised concerns about vendor payments became proof of disloyalty. My investigations into suspicious transactions became unauthorized access to confidential information. My documentation of his fraud became evidence of my own misconduct. It was masterful. Evil. But masterful. Emily, Margaret said, her voice strained. Do you have anything to say about these allegations? I sat perfectly still, feeling the weight of 14 stares. Dane was still standing, radiating confidence, waiting for me to crumble or defend myself or do anything that would make this easier for him. Instead, I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a folder of my own. Thicker than his. Much thicker. Actually, yes, I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. I do have something to say. I opened the folder and spread the first document across the table. It was a wire transfer record showing $150,000 moving from our operating account to a shell company in the British Virgin Islands. Dane's signature was clearly visible on the authorization form. But I think these documents will speak louder than I ever could. The room went completely silent. Dane's confident expression flickered for just a moment, but it was enough. So you're firing me, I said, looking directly at him. That's fine. But everyone in this room deserves to know exactly what they're protecting. The silence in the room was absolute. Even the air conditioning seemed to pause as I methodically laid out document after document across the polished conference table. Wire transfer records, bank statements, forged authorization forms, email chains that revealed the careful construction of Dane's lies. This is Strategic Assessment Partners, I said, placing a corporate filing next to the wire transfer. Incorporated in Delaware 3 days before receiving their first payment from us. The registered address is a UPS store. The beneficial owner is a trust controlled by, I looked directly at Dane, someone who shares your mother's maiden name. Dane had gone pale, but he tried to maintain composure. Emily, this is exactly the kind of paranoid behavior that's been... I'm not finished. My voice cut through his attempt at deflection like a blade. This is Meridian Research Group. They've received $340,000 for due diligence reports that don't exist. The account receiving these payments is in the Cayman Islands. I pulled out another set of documents. Margaret leaned forward, her face shifting from confusion to horror as she recognized the company letterhead. These are the consulting agreements Dane provided to justify the payments. Notice anything interesting about the signatures? I placed a known sample of Margaret's signature next to the ones on the consulting agreements. Even from across the table, the differences were obvious. The forged signatures were close, but not close enough to fool anyone who cared to look. He's been forging your signature, Margaret, for 18 months. The room exploded. Board members were talking over each other, demanding explanations. One of the external directors, a former federal prosecutor named Patricia Valdez, stood up and walked around the table to examine the documents herself. Jesus Christ, she whispered, flipping through the bank records. How much are we talking about? $2.3 million, I said. Diverted from our operating accounts, our due diligence budgets, and our charitable giving funds. All of it routed through shell companies that ultimately lead back to accounts controlled by Dane. Dane finally found his voice. This is insane. Emily's been building this conspiracy theory for months. She's manipulating documents, taking things out of context. Am I? I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a laptop. Because I have something else you might find interesting. I opened the laptop and turned it around so everyone could see the screen. It was a video call interface. and on the other end was a man in his 50s wearing a suit. Everyone, I'd like you to meet David Rodriguez from Hartwell and Associates. They're the independent forensic accounting firm I hired 6 weeks ago to verify my findings. The man on the screen nodded professionally. Good morning. I can confirm that we've conducted a preliminary review of the documentation Ms. Carson provided. The evidence strongly suggests systematic financial fraud involving the diversion of approximately $2.3 million in corporate funds through a network of shell companies and offshore accounts. The room was completely silent now. Even Dane had stopped trying to interrupt. We've also verified that multiple authorization documents bear forged signatures, Rodriguez continued. The pattern of activity suggests deliberate intent to conceal the movement of funds from legitimate oversight. Patricia Valdez looked up from the documents. David, what's your recommendation regarding reporting requirements? Any organization discovering fraud of this magnitude has 72 hours to report it to the SEC and relevant law enforcement agencies. Given the use of offshore accounts and interstate wire transfers, this likely falls under federal jurisdiction. I closed the laptop and looked around the table. So yes, Dane, you can fire me. But this doesn't go away just because I'm gone. The evidence exists whether I work here or not. Margaret had been silent throughout most of the exchange, but now she stood up. Dane, you're suspended immediately. Security will escort you from the building. This is ridiculous, Dane said, but his voice lacked conviction. I've dedicated 15 years to this company. I've brought in millions in revenue. You've stolen millions in revenue, I interrupted. And you tried to destroy my career to cover it up. I stood up and gathered my documents. I want to be clear about something. This isn't about revenge. This is about fraud. You can spin it however you want, but the numbers don't lie. As security entered the room, I looked directly at Dane one last time. You were right about one thing, though. I have been documenting everything, every conversation, every suspicious transaction, every time you undermined my authority to protect your scheme. The difference between us, I said, is that I was documenting the truth. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Within an hour of my presentation, the board had voted unanimously to suspend Dane pending a full investigation. Security escorted him from the building while he was still trying to explain away the evidence, his voice growing more desperate with each failed justification. Margaret found me in my office 2 hours later, looking like she'd aged a decade in a single morning. Emily, I need to ask you something directly, she said, closing the door behind her. How long have you known? I've suspected for 6 months. I've had proof for 6 weeks. She sat down heavily in the chair across from my desk. Why didn't you come to me sooner? I tried. Remember when I raised concerns about the consulting fees? You told me Dane had already explained the process to you. Except, he hadn't. Had he? Margaret's face flushed. He told me you were being overly cautious about routine vendor payments. He said you were having trouble adapting to our growth trajectory. He was positioning me as the problem while he systematically looted our accounts. If I'd brought you incomplete evidence, he would have found a way to discredit it and remove me from the equation entirely. So you hired an independent forensic accountant. I hired 3. Hartwell and Associates did the primary analysis. Morrison Financial verified their findings. And I had a former FBI financial crimes investigator review the offshore structures. I pulled out another folder. They all reached the same conclusion. Dane wasn't just stealing money. He was sophisticated about it. Margaret stared at the documents. What happens now? Now? We follow the law. We report this to the SEC within 72 hours. We cooperate fully with federal investigators. And we implement controls to make sure this never happens again. I mean with you, with your job. I had been thinking about that question all morning. I'm not sure I want my old job back. What do you mean? Margaret, Dane was able to do this because our oversight systems were designed to trust rather than verify. He exploited that trust systematically. If you want to prevent this from happening again, you need someone with the authority to implement real controls, not just someone who raises concerns that get dismissed. She was quiet for a long moment. What are you proposing? Chief Risk Officer, independent reporting structure, direct access to the board for compliance issues, and authority to conduct unannounced audits of any department, anytime. That's a significant change in responsibility. It's a significant change in what this company needs. The question is whether you're willing to make that change, or whether you'd prefer to hope this was an isolated incident. Margaret stood up and walked to the window overlooking downtown Denver. The board meeting is reconvening at 4. We need to decide how to handle the SEC reporting, the client communications, and the internal investigation. And Dane's problems are just beginning. Patricia Valdez is already on the phone with the U.S. Attorney's Office. Something about RICO implications when you involve offshore accounts and forged signatures. I felt a grim satisfaction at that news. Good. Emily, I need to apologize. I should have listened to you more carefully. I should have questioned why Dane was so eager to marginalize your concerns. You weren't the only one he fooled. He was very good at what he did. But you saw through it. I saw through it because I was looking at the numbers instead of listening to the explanations. Numbers don't lie. Margaret, people do. She turned back to face me. Are you going to stay? That depends on whether you're serious about preventing this from happening again, or whether you just want to patch things up and move on. I'm serious. Then we'll see what the board says at 4 o'clock. As she left my office, I looked out at the Denver skyline and felt something I hadn't experienced in months. The satisfaction of a job well done. Not just catching the fraud, but surviving the attempt to destroy my career. Dane had made one crucial mistake. He'd assumed I would be too afraid to fight back. He'd been wrong about that, too. The next 48 hours moved like a carefully choreographed dance of corporate damage control and federal investigation. I found myself at the center of it all. No longer the assistant CFO who raised inconvenient questions, but the key witness in what the FBI Financial Crimes Unit was calling one of the most sophisticated private equity fraud schemes they'd seen in years. By Wednesday afternoon, federal agents had seized Dane's computers, frozen his personal accounts, and issued subpoenas for records from 3 different offshore banks. The forensic accountants I'd hired were now working directly with the Justice Department, and their preliminary findings had expanded the scope of the investigation significantly. It's not just the $2.3 million, Agent Sarah Martinez explained during our interview. Your documentation helped us identify a pattern that goes back 3 years. We think the total could be closer to $4 million. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. I'd been so focused on the transactions I could definitively prove that I'd missed the broader scope of Dane's operation. 3 years? He was more careful in the beginning. Smaller amounts, longer gaps between transactions. But your records gave us the template to identify earlier instances of the same shell company structures. That afternoon, Margaret called an emergency all-hands meeting. The entire staff of Lunaris Ventures, 43 people, packed into our main conference room. The tension was palpable. Everyone knew something major had happened, but the official story was still personnel changes under review. Margaret stood at the front of the room, looking every bit the CEO who just discovered her company had been systematically looted by one of her most trusted executives. I need to address some serious matters that have come to light, she began. First, Dane Holloway is no longer with the company. He was terminated yesterday for financial misconduct that we've reported to appropriate authorities. A murmur ran through the room. Several people looked shocked. Others, particularly those who'd worked closely with Dane, looked relieved. Second, I want to publicly acknowledge Emily Carson, who discovered the misconduct and brought it to our attention. Her diligence and professionalism likely saved this company from catastrophic damage. The room erupted in applause. I felt my face flush as people turned to look at me. This wasn't how I'd imagined vindication would feel. There was satisfaction, yes, but also a strange sadness. 3 years of stolen money meant 3 years of reduced employee bonuses, delayed equipment purchases, and canceled projects. Dane's fraud had touched everyone in that room. Finally, Margaret continued, the board has asked me to announce some organizational changes. Emily will be assuming the newly created position of Chief Risk Officer, reporting directly to the board. This position will have independent authority to review all financial processes and ensure this type of situation never happens again. More applause, but I could see the questions in people's faces. The smart ones were already doing the math, figuring out that my discovery of misconduct had probably been months in the making. After the meeting, I found myself surrounded by colleagues offering congratulations and asking careful questions about what had really happened. I gave the same answer to everyone. I did my job. I followed the numbers. The numbers told a story that needed to be heard. But the real satisfaction came at the end of the day. When I received a call from Agent Martinez, "Thought you'd want to know," she said. "Dane's attorney called this morning. He wants to discuss a plea arrangement." Already, when the evidence is this solid, smart lawyers don't waste time on defenses that won't work. He's looking at federal fraud charges, tax evasion, and conspiracy. Without a plea deal, he's facing 15 to 20 years. I hung up the phone and sat in my new office, bigger than my old one, with windows facing downtown Denver and a door that finally had my name on it with a title that mattered. Dane had tried to destroy my career to protect his crimes. Instead, his crimes had built my career into something stronger than I'd ever imagined possible. The irony wasn't lost on me. Sometimes the best revenge is just doing your job exceptionally well. 6 months later, I stood in the same conference room where Dane had tried to destroy my career. This time, I was presenting the quarterly risk assessment to a board that now included 2 new independent directors with backgrounds in financial crimes investigation. The transformation had been remarkable. We'd implemented real-time transaction monitoring, mandatory dual approval for all payments over $10,000, and quarterly audits by rotating independent firms. The shell game that Dane had played for 3 years would be impossible under our new systems. The controls are working. I reported to the board. We've identified and prevented 4 potentially problematic transactions this quarter alone. Nothing fraudulent, but expenses that didn't meet our documentation standards. Margaret nodded approvingly. And Dane's situation? Sentencing is next month. His plea agreement calls for 8 years federal prison and full restitution of $4.2 million. I paused, letting that number sink in. The final accounting showed he'd stolen even more than we initially discovered. Patricia Valdez, who'd stayed on as our lead independent director, looked up from her notes. Any word on asset recovery? The government seized his house in Aspen, his investment accounts, and a boat he'd bought with stolen money. We'll recover about 60% of what he took. The offshore accounts are proving more difficult to access, but the FBI thinks they can trace most of it. As the meeting concluded, I gathered my papers and reflected on the journey. Dane was facing 8 years in federal prison, his reputation destroyed, his assets seized. Meanwhile, I was sitting in a corner office with a 6-figure salary increase and the respect of an industry that had initially dismissed me as overly cautious. But the real victory wasn't professional. It was personal. I'd refused to be intimidated. I'd trusted my instincts, done my homework, and stood up for what was right, even when it would have been easier to stay quiet. The last time I'd seen Dane was in the courthouse hallway during his plea hearing. He'd looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of his crimes and the certainty of his punishment. Our eyes met for a brief moment, and I saw something I'd never seen before: genuine fear. I didn't feel anger or satisfaction. I felt nothing at all. That's when I knew I'd truly won. His actions no longer had the power to affect my emotions. He'd become irrelevant to my life in every way that mattered. I walked back to my office and sat down at my desk, looking out at the Denver skyline. On my computer screen was an email from a whistleblower at another firm, someone who'd heard about our case and wanted advice about suspicious activity at their company. I opened the email and started typing my response. There were more Danes out there, and more people like me who needed to know that speaking up was worth the risk. The phone rang. Another potential case. Another chance to prove that the truth, properly documented and courageously presented, could overcome any amount of corporate manipulation. I answered the phone and got back to work. Not everyone falls for the trap. Some people set traps right in the middle of the boardroom. Thank you for listening to this story of corporate justice and personal vindication. I'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening to this story? Are you at work, at home, or somewhere else entirely? Please leave a comment below sharing your thoughts and your location so we can connect with fellow listeners around the world. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and share your own experiences with workplace challenges. Your stories matter, and together we can inspire others to stand up for what's right.